The chain struck the steel tower 3 times before Jonah Mercer found the dog buried to her chest in new snow. The German Shepherd wore a torn charity harness, and a length of blasting wire was twisted through the links around her neck. When Jonah raised a hand, signal no one had used in 10 years, the dog dropped flat and stared toward the closed pass. That signal belonged to Mason Kerr, the teammate who had once destroyed Jonah's career and then vanished into the mountains. By nightfall, Jonah would learn that the maps protecting Blackpine Basin had been changed, the avalanche lines had moved, and veterans were losing their land one signature at a time. But the hardest truth was waiting beneath the snow. Mason had not simply betrayed him, and the dog had not come to Jonah by accident. Stay with this story. Tell us where you are listening from, and if loyalty, courage, and second chances still matter to you, help our community reach 5,000 subscribers. The chain struck the steel tower 3 times before Jonah Mercer saw what was making the sound. He had already passed the avalanche control station once. The structure stood on a shelf of rock above Blackpine Basin, all rusted braces, a narrow maintenance platform, and cables that disappeared into the white slope. It had been decommissioned 6 winters earlier, after a newer remote system was installed farther up the pass. The county had left it in place because removing it would cost more than pretending it no longer mattered. Jonah was halfway back to his truck when the metal rang again. Not wind, not loose hardware. 3 impacts unevenly spaced, followed by a wet scraping sound beneath the platform. He stopped with one boot angled downhill. Snow had begun before dawn, and now fell in soft, steady sheets, thick enough to erase his tire tracks within minutes. The temperature had dropped 10 degrees since he left the cabin. Above the pass, clouds pressed low over the ridge, hiding the cornices that formed after every early season storm. Jonah listened. Nothing. He moved uphill again, favoring his left shoulder when the incline steepened. At 54, he still carried the square, compact build of the man who had once spent half his life preparing to enter places other people were trying to escape. The years had softened none of the alertness in his gray eyes. They had only made him slower to trust what they showed him. The old tower's lower braces formed a dark cage beneath the platform. Snow had drifted against the west side, nearly 4 feet high. Jonah came around the eastern support and found a hollow where something had been moving. A German Shepherd lay inside it. For 1 second, the dog looked like part of the drift. Black saddle, red-brown shoulders, one white front toe, barely visible beneath powder. Then her head lifted. Her right ear leaned slightly sideways, the cartilage bent from an old injury. A steel chain ran from a thick leather collar to a maintenance ring bolted through the tower leg. The dog did not bark. She watched his hands. Jonah crouched 10 feet away and removed his gloves slowly. The cold bit into his fingers at once. He placed the gloves on the snow where she could see them. "Easy," he said. The dog's eyes moved to his mouth and back to his hands. There was dried blood along one foreleg, though the wound did not look deep. A canvas harness clung to her ribs, dark with meltwater. Someone had cut away the patch where a name or unit would normally be stitched. Only part of a circular emblem remained near the shoulder. A white mountain above 2 clasped hands. Jonah knew the emblem. Summit Honor Foundation. The largest veterans charity in western Colorado had built 6 winterized cottages in Blackpine Basin and helped older former service members keep heat in homes they could no longer afford to repair. Its founder, Caleb Voss, spoke at funerals, county meetings, church suppers, and every televised fundraiser within driving distance. The dog shifted. The chain snapped tight. A strip of orange cord was twisted through the links near her collar. Jonah leaned sideways for a better look and felt the back of his neck tighten. It was not cord. It was detonating lead line, the kind used with controlled charges in rock work and avalanche mitigation. The end had been cut cleanly. A small metal tag, blackened by heat, hung from one strand. Jonah looked up at the empty slope. The new control system was 2 miles north. No licensed crew had reason to bring blasting wire to this abandoned tower. Certainly no reason to fasten it to a dog. He took one slow step closer. The Shepherd flattened herself instantly, chest against the snowhead, low, as if an invisible line had been drawn in front of her. Jonah stopped. "Not the chain," he murmured. Her body had gone still before the links tightened. She was reacting to the distance, not the restraint. He looked at the snow between them. A faint blue streak crossed the surface, nearly hidden beneath fresh powder. Survey paint. Someone had marked a boundary from one tower leg to another. The dog would not cross it. Jonah had seen trained animals refuse doorways, pressure plates, contaminated zones, and lines they had been conditioned to treat as lethal. Sometimes the training saved lives. Sometimes a cruel person used obedience as a cage stronger than steel. He lowered himself to one knee. "Who taught you that?" The dog's left ear turned toward him. A gust pushed snow beneath the platform. She shivered but did not move. Jonah studied the collar. No tag. No visible chip label. The buckle had been cinched too tight, either because someone wanted to keep her from slipping free, or because they had not cared what swelling might do after hours in the cold. He could cut the chain. That would not make her cross the paint. His truck carried blankets, bolt cutters, a trauma kit, and a satellite communicator. It also carried a small avalanche beacon he kept from habit. Though the county maintained this road, and his cabin sat below the usual slide path. He had learned too young that usual was a word people used before explaining why something had gone wrong. He stood and backed away. The dog did not rise. At the truck, Jonah called the sheriff's office first. The dispatcher told him both deputies on winter duty were dealing with a rollover below Pike Creek and could not reach the pass for at least 40 minutes. County Animal Control had one officer who was currently 70 miles away. "Stay clear of the dog if she appears aggressive," the dispatcher said. "She appears hypothermic. Then do what you can without putting yourself at risk." Jonah almost laughed. That sentence had followed him through half his adult life, always spoken by someone standing farther from the danger. He took the bolt cutters and emergency blanket from behind the seat. When he lifted the avalanche beacon from the center console, it gave its short startup chirp. The sound traveled across the snow. The dog slammed herself sideways beneath the tower. The chain snapped against steel. She clawed at the drift, trying to force her body into the narrow space between a cross brace and the ground. Her injured leg folded. A low sound tore from her throat, not aggression but panic, so complete it seemed to erase everything except escape. Jonah switched off the beacon. The dog kept digging. He set the equipment down and approached without the cutters. The shepherd's shoulder struck the brace twice before he reached her. He crouched outside the blue line and held both hands where she could see them. "Look at me." She did not. He tried again lower. Eyes. The dog's digging slowed for half a second. That response was not enough to prove training, but it was enough to touch an old room in Jonah's memory. A concrete training bay in Virginia. Mason Kerr, kneeling beside a young sable shepherd borrowed from the kennels, Mason laughing because Jonah's hand signal looked in his words like a man trying to hail a taxi underwater. They had built their own small vocabulary after that. Nothing official, nothing classified. Signals for hold circle return, safe route and one motion Mason called. Take the line, 2 fingers extended, palm down, then drawn toward the chest. It meant, the marked boundary is no longer active. Cross to me. Jonah had not used it in 10 years. He raised his right hand. The dog stopped digging. Snow clung to her muzzle. Her breathing came fast and shallow. Jonah extended 2 fingers, palm down, and pulled them slowly toward his chest. Take the line. The shepherd stared at him. Then she lowered herself fully into the snow. It was not the expected response. In their old system, down meant recognition followed by uncertainty. The animal had heard the language but did not yet trust the speaker. Jonah felt something cold move through him that had nothing to do with the weather. "Mason," he said. The dog's head lifted. He had not intended to speak the name. It left his mouth with the weight of a word he had refused for years. Mason Kerr had been Jonah's teammate, friend, and the nearest thing to a brother after Jonah's father died. He had also been the man who promised to testify beside him in a safety inquiry and withdrew his statement the night before the hearing. The official report called the training accident unpredictable. Jonah had called it preventable. A senior commander had altered equipment logs after a diver nearly drowned during a cold water exercise. Jonah found the original entries and demanded an investigation. Mason saw the same records. He agreed to confirm them. Then he did not. Without Mason, the inquiry collapsed into questions about Jonah's judgment. Jonah kept his rank, but lost his place in the unit. Invitations stopped. Conversations ended when he entered rooms. His marriage, already strained by years of absence, broke under the pressure of public silence and private rage. Mason sent 3 messages over the next year. Jonah answered none. After that, nothing. Until now. The dog tried to rise. Her back legs trembled. Jonah repeated the signal. Take the line. She placed one front paw over the faded blue paint. The chain tightened before she could bring the second paw forward. She looked back at the steel links, then at Jonah. The fear in her face was not helplessness. It was a calculation between 2 kinds of danger. Jonah moved closer to the line and lowered the bolt cutters onto the snow. I'm not touching you until you let me, he said. But I'm cutting that chain. The shepherd held still. He reached for the first link beyond her collar. The dog watched his fingers. The metal was thicker than it had looked. Hardened utility chain, not something purchased for a kennel. Jonah set the jaws of the cutters and leaned his weight down. The link resisted. His left shoulder burned. He shifted his grip, braced one handle against his thigh, and pressed again. The chain broke with a sharp crack. The dog flinched but did not retreat. Jonah tossed the loose length behind him. A shorter section still hung from her collar, along with the blasting wire. He could remove it later. For now, there was only the line. He backed up 3 steps and gave the signal once more. The shepherd stood. Her injured foreleg touched the snow lightly. The rest of her weight shifted forward. One paw crossed the blue paint, then another. She paused halfway through, body trembling so hard the loose chain tapped against the tower brace. Jonah kept his hand raised. Come on. The dog crossed. She did not rush him. She walked 2 uneven steps and stopped just outside his reach. Her nose lifted. She smelled his coat, the leather strap of his old field, watched the cold iron scent from the bolt cutters. Then she touched the watch with her nose. Jonah's breath caught. Mason had given him that watch after a night exercise in Alaska. After Jonah's issued one froze and stopped. The band had been replaced twice, but a shallow dent remained beside the clasp, where Mason had struck it against a hatch, and sworn it improved the accuracy. The shepherd smelled it again. Her eyes met Jonah's. He turned his wrist so she could take the scent fully. That's right, he said. You know him. The dog leaned forward until her forehead rested briefly against his hand. Jonah closed his fingers around the side of her neck, careful of the tight collar. The contact lasted only a second before she stepped away, but it was permission. He wrapped the emergency blanket around her shoulders and worked the collar loose 1 notch. Under the leather, the fur was rubbed bare in a red ring. The cut harness patch had left a few threads beneath the seam. Jonah pulled them aside and found a name embroidered on the inner lining where whoever removed the outer patch had not thought to look. Rook, Rook, he said. The dog's ears moved forward. So that was one answer. He needed many more. Jonah guided her toward the truck slowly. She stopped at every painted survey mark along the access path. Each time he used the old signal. Each time she crossed after a delay. At the passenger door, Rook refused to jump. Jonah opened the rear door instead and built a step from a folded traction board. She climbed in under her own power, turned twice on the blanket, and lay down facing the road north. Before closing the door, Jonah examined the orange blasting line twisted through the broken chain. The blackened metal tag carried 3 stamped characters beneath the soot. A.N. Zaven. Elk Needle 7. Jonah knew the name. Elk Needle was an old snow study site, high on the north side of the pass, sealed after a roof collapse and officially inaccessible since the county replaced manual readings with remote sensors. Mason had worked there for Summit Honor during his first winter in Blackpine. Jonah shut the door and looked uphill. The snowfall had thickened. Beyond the abandoned tower, the pass disappeared into white. A small orange marker stood near the tree line. He had noticed it on the drive-in, but assumed it marked the boundary of the old avalanche zone. Now he walked to it and brushed away snow from the base. The wooden stake had been painted recently. The blue stripe across it was bright, beneath the new powder, though the county map in Jonah's truck showed no active survey line at this location. On the far side of the stake, pressed into wet paint, was the partial track of a dog's paw. Rook had come from the north. Jonah returned to the truck and activated the satellite communicator without sound. He sent his location and a request for a veterinarian to the sheriff's dispatcher. Then he placed the avalanche beacon inside a padded bag so it would not chirp again. Rook watched every movement. When Jonah started the engine, the dashboard gave a soft electronic tone. The dog flattened instantly, then forced herself upright. She stared north through the windshield. Not toward Black Pine. Not toward safety. Toward Elk Needle. Jonah rested one hand on the steering wheel. Snow blurred the pass until road, sky, and mountain became the same color. He had found a dog beneath a forgotten tower. The chain around her neck carried blasting wire from a station that had been closed for years. She knew a hand signal invented by a man Jonah had spent a decade refusing to forgive. And whatever waited beyond the white ridge had frightened Rook badly enough to make her fear a simple electronic beep more than the cold. Jonah shifted the truck into gear. He drove downhill toward Black Pine, but Rook did not turn away from the north. Neither did he. Black Pine Basin sat in a bowl of mountains that caught weather before the rest of the county knew it was coming. By the time Jonah reached the valley floor, the pass behind him had vanished inside a gray wall. Snow collected along the roofs of the old mining houses and softened the sharp edges of the highway signs. The church bell near Main Street struck noon, though the cloud cover made the hour look closer to evening. Rook remained in the rear seat, wrapped in the emergency blanket. Every time the truck crossed a painted lane marker, her head lifted. At traffic lights, she watched the electronic pedestrian signals with the fixed attention of an animal waiting for punishment. The veterinary clinic occupied a renovated feed store at the south end of town. A hand-painted sign above the door read Basin Animal Care. Jonah parked beside a snowplow and called from the truck so no electronic entrance chime would surprise her. Dr. Miriam Cole came out carrying a rubber-backed mat and a leash with a wide cloth loop. She was 61 small, through the shoulders, with white hair cut short enough that the snow could not cling to it. Jonah had known her since she stitched a ranch dog's ear while he held a flashlight at age 15. "You look older," she said. "So do you?" "I earned it. You just collected damage." Her eyes moved past him to Rook. "That her?" Jonah nodded. Miriam placed the mat over the metal threshold and disabled the door chime from inside. She did not reach into the truck. Instead, she opened both clinic doors and created a clear path to the examination room. Rook would not step onto the yellow parking stripe. Jonah gave the old signal. 2 fingers down, draw inward. "Take the line." The dog crossed after a long pause. Miriam noticed. "Working command." "Unofficial one." "Whose?" Jonah closed the truck door. "Mason Kerr's." The veterinarian's expression changed only around the eyes. "That Mason. There's another. Not in a town this small." Inside, Rook allowed Miriam to examine her as long as Jonah stayed within sight. The cut on the foreleg came from sharp metal and had begun to close around dirt. The collar had caused skin damage but no deep infection. Mild hypothermia, dehydration, bruising across the ribs, and muscle loss in the hindquarters suggested she had been confined or moving very little for several weeks. Miriam clipped away wet fur around the foreleg. Beneath it, faint blue paint stained the white toe. "Industrial marking paint," she said. "Not house paint." There was a blue survey line under the tower. Rook turned her head at the word tower. Miriam noticed that too. The dog's paws held more evidence than her wounds. Fine gray grit packed between the pads. Tiny flakes of bright blue coating clung near the nails. One sliver of aluminum was lodged in the fur above the dewclaw. Miriam placed each sample in a separate envelope. "Do you think she came from Elk Needle?" Jonah asked. "I think you decided that before you walked in." The blasting line was marked EN7. Miriam stopped writing. She looked at the orange cord Jonah had sealed inside a plastic equipment bag. "Show me." He held the bag beneath the lamp. Miriam did not touch it. "That is not county issue," she said. "The county uses red lead line with coated sleeves. Summit Honor bought orange line for its private mitigation crews 2 winters ago. You know that for a fact. I treated a technician who nearly lost 3 fingers because he wrapped it around his hand while loading a sled. Summit Honor had a blasting crew. They had a licensed contractor. Caleb Voss said the foundation needed independent control work to protect its housing sites." Miriam finished wrapping Rook's foreleg, then scanned the dog for a microchip. The reader returned an active number registered to Summit Honor Foundation. The owner line showed a secondary handler, Mason Kerr. Jonah looked at the screen until the letters blurred. When was it updated? 18 months ago. Emergency contact is the foundation office. Do not call them yet. Miriam set the scanner down. You brought me a dog registered to a local organization and asked me not to notify the owner. She was chained to an abandoned avalanche tower with explosive lead line. That is a reason to call the sheriff, not a reason to make me guess your plan. I already called, and they are still at the rollover. Miriam removed her gloves. Then you have perhaps 20 minutes before Caleb hears from someone else. Half the town saw your truck come down the pass with a shepherd in the back. Jonah knew she was right. Black Pine did not spread rumors quickly. It processed them with the efficiency of emergency radio. He paid for the examination, though Miriam argued that he had not technically adopted the dog. Jonah argued that she had technically provided medical treatment. Rook drank half a bowl of water, refused food, and positioned herself between Jonah and the only door without an electronic lock. The sheriff's deputy arrived, just as Jonah prepared to leave. Eli Navarro was 46 wide across the chest, with a trimmed black beard and a winter uniform that never seemed warm enough for him. Jonah remembered him as a quiet high school wrestler who later joined the army, came home with a damaged knee, and discovered law enforcement involved. Less running than recruiting brochures suggested. Eli listened without interrupting. He photographed the collar injuries, the harness, the wire, and the paint on Rook's foot. He recorded the microchip information and called the county avalanche office. No work scheduled at the old tower, he said after the call. No permit for private mitigation within 5 miles today. Someone left her there before the storm, Jonah said. Maybe. You think she tied herself to the tower? I think certainty is expensive, and we have not paid for it yet. That sounded like a sentence Mason would have used. Jonah disliked Eli a little for it. The deputy asked where Jonah intended to take Rook. My cabin. Summit Honor is the registered owner. Summit Honor can explain why their dog was chained in an avalanche zone. They can also demand her return. Will you make me hand her over? Eli looked at Rook. The shepherd watched the deputy's hands without growling. Not while the possible neglect case is open, he said. But I need you to understand that keeping her does not make you invisible. I've never had that problem. Eli's gaze stayed on him a moment longer. Everyone in town knew some version of why Jonah had left the Navy. Few knew the truth, and fewer had ever asked. When Jonah stepped outside, 3 vehicles waited in the clinic lot. One belonged to a rancher collecting medication. One carried the local newspaper logo. The third was a white Summit Honor van. Caleb Voss stood beside it. He wore a navy wool coat over work pants and insulated boots, the uniform of a man wealthy enough to choose practical clothing rather than advertise the cost. At 58, Caleb had thick silver hair, a square face, and the patient expression of someone accustomed to being thanked in public. Snow gathered on his shoulders while he spoke with a woman from the newspaper. He saw Jonah and excused himself. Jonah Mercer, he said. I heard you were back in the basin. I heard your dog was missing. Caleb glanced through the clinic window. Rook stood beside the examination table. His face showed relief, then sadness, both arriving with believable timing. Thank God. You did not know where she was. We have been searching for 6 days. Where is Mason? Caleb's eyes returned to Jonah. So that is why you are here. I was here before I found the dog. That was not what I meant. Caleb motioned toward the community center across the street. A banner stretched over the entrance. Summit Honor Winter Home Fund. Volunteers carried boxes of blankets through the doors. Older veterans and their spouses gathered inside beneath strings of white lights. We are about to begin, Caleb said. Come in. We can talk somewhere warm. Jonah should have waited for Eli. He should have allowed the deputy to preserve whatever uncertainty remained before Caleb shaped the story in front of an audience. Instead, he followed. The community center smelled of coffee, wool coats, and vegetable soup. Photographs covered one wall. Roofs repaired after storms, ramps built for injured veterans, furnaces installed in isolated cabins. Caleb appeared in many of them but rarely stood at the center. His talent was making generosity look like a collective act while ensuring everyone remembered who had organized it. People recognized Jonah. Some nodded. Others looked away with the discomfort reserved for a man associated with an old dispute no one fully understood. Caleb led him to a storage room behind the stage. Mason stole equipment from us, he said when the door closed. Detonators survey files, 2 encrypted drives, and cash from an emergency account. How much? $84,000. Jonah gave no reaction. Caleb continued. He altered hazard reports to hide unauthorized control work. When our board confronted him, he disappeared with Rook. You reported him to the sheriff and the state licensing office. Then why did Eli act like he did not know the dog was missing? I reported Mason. Rook was presumed with him. Presumed is a useful word. Caleb's mouth tightened, then relaxed. I know what happened between you and Mason. He spoke about it more than once. Did he tell you why he withdrew his testimony? He said he failed you. That is not an answer. It may be the only one he had. Caleb opened a metal cabinet and removed a paper folder. He showed Jonah copies of purchase records for blasting material Mason's signature on hazard maps and a bank withdrawal bearing his authorization code. The documents looked clean. Too clean. Jonah had spent years learning that false stories rarely failed because they contained no facts. They failed because the facts had been arranged to produce only one possible conclusion. Where was his last known location? Jonah asked. Elk Needle. The name settled between them. Caleb saw Jonah recognize it. We found his snowcat near the lower gate, he said. No sign of him. There was a small slide 2 days later. Search teams found nothing. Why was Rook chained at the old tower? I do not know. Why was your blasting line threaded through her chain? Caleb's expression changed by less than a degree. You brought it with you. That is your first question. My first concern is whether unstable material is inside a public clinic. It is inert, lead line. Caleb looked toward the wall as though imagining the dog beyond it. Mason may have restrained her himself, he said. If he was injured or disoriented, perhaps he thought someone would find her. Then he used a chain tight enough to strip her neck. You want me to defend what I do not understand. I want you to stop speaking as though confusion belongs only to other people. The door opened. A volunteer leaned in and told Caleb the donors were ready. Caleb nodded, then turned back to Jonah. Stay for 5 minutes, he said. Look at the people you are about to accuse me of harming. I accused you of nothing. You came into this building carrying suspicion like a weapon. Men notice weapons, even when they remain holstered. Jonah followed him onto the stage. Caleb stood behind the lectern and spoke without notes. He described heating grants, medication deliveries, a new accessible housing unit, and 3 veterans who would have lost their homes without emergency assistance. He named the donors who repaired roofs. He thanked the church cooks. He called Summit Honor a promise that no one who served would freeze alone in the mountains. The room applauded. Then Caleb invited Jonah forward. It was done so smoothly that refusing would look hostile. Many of you remember Jonah Mercer, Caleb said. He found Rook today alive on the pass. Relief moved through the room. Several people clapped. A woman near the front put one hand over her mouth. Jonah stepped to the microphone. He could have said the dog was safe. He could have asked for information about Mason. He could have waited until evidence became stronger than instinct. Instead, he looked at the men and women whose gratitude Caleb had carefully placed around himself like armor. Rook was chained beneath an abandoned avalanche tower, Jonah said. She carried blasting line registered to this foundation, and she was afraid of an electronic beacon. Before anyone gives another dollar, Caleb Voss needs to explain how that happened. The room went silent. Caleb did not interrupt. That was worse. A man in the second row stood. Owen Price, a Vietnam veteran who lived in one of Summit Honor's cottages, leaned on 2 canes. Caleb put heat in my house when the county told me to wait 6 weeks, Owen said. What have you done for anybody here? Jonah had no answer that would fit the room. Another voice said Mason had stolen money. Someone else called him dangerous. The newspaper woman raised her phone to record. Caleb finally stepped beside Jonah. Rook's condition will be investigated, he said. We will cooperate fully. Until then, please do not turn a wounded animal into proof of whatever old grievance brought you back to Blackpine. The phrase struck exactly where Caleb intended. Old grievance. Around the room, people nodded. Jonah left before anger made the next decision for him. Outside, Eli waited beside the clinic. His face said he had heard enough through the wall. You just made my job harder, the deputy said. I made his story public. You told him what evidence you found. Jonah looked across the street. Caleb stood inside the community center window, one hand on Owen Price's shoulder while volunteers gathered around him. He already knew about the wire, Jonah said. Maybe. Now, we will never know whether his reaction came from knowledge or from what you told him. Rook climbed into Jonah's truck slowly. As he reached to secure the rear harness, Caleb emerged from the community center carrying a black handheld control unit. He used it to raise the foundation van's hydraulic wheelchair lift. The unit emitted 2 quick beeps. Roque froze, her eyes fixed on Caleb's hand. Caleb saw her reaction. For the first time that day, his face lost the expression meant for other people. Only for a second. Then he lowered the control unit and walked to the driver's door. Jonah watched him leave. Eli watched Jonah. Neither man spoke. The road to Jonah's cabin climbed west of town through dense spruce. Snow had deepened enough that he engaged 4-wheel drive before the first switchback. Roque lay in the rear, awake and rigid whenever the dashboard chimed. Halfway up the mountain moved. A dull concussion rolled through the trees. The truck shook. Snow burst from the slope above in a low white wave, not large enough to bury the road, but heavy enough to sweep branches, stones, and powder across both lanes. Jonah braked before the slide reached them. The white cloud struck the hood and windshield. For several seconds he saw nothing. Roque threw herself against the rear door, then stopped. Through the glass high above the blocked road, a red warning light flashed once on a ridge where no county control work had been scheduled. Jonah turned off the engine. The new snow settled around the truck. Someone had known which road he would take home, and someone had just made sure he could not reach it. By the time the snow stopped sliding, the road in front of Jonah's truck had disappeared beneath a waist-high bank of broken branches and compacted powder. The slide was small by mountain standards. It had crossed less than 40 yards of highway and carried no trees thicker than a man's arm. But it was deliberate enough to change the next hour of Jonah's life, and timing was often the only difference between inconvenience and warning. He checked Roque first. She had wedged herself behind the driver's seat. Her eyes remained fixed on the windshield, and the fur along her back stood in a dark ridge. Jonah opened the rear door, but she would not move toward the snowbank. He saw the faded yellow center line beneath the truck and understood. Take the line. 2 fingers palm down, drawn inward. Roque stepped across. Jonah gave her water, then climbed onto the hood with binoculars. The red light he had seen above the road was gone. Through gaps in the trees, he found the dark outline of a portable control box mounted beside a service trail. The county used similar boxes for remote avalanche charges, but this unit stood below any mapped starting zone. His satellite communicator showed no signal under the heavy timber. The truck radio picked up only static, and a weather station repeating storm totals from the valley. Jonah took the shovel from the bed and began clearing a narrow path around the largest debris. Roque watched him for several minutes before approaching the base of the slide. She smelled one broken branch, then another. Near the edge of the road, she stopped beside a fist-sized piece of blue-painted wood. The color matched the paint beneath the old tower. Jonah picked it up with a cloth. The wood had been freshly split. One side carried black numbers. 14BA, survey stake. There should have been no active survey on this road either. He placed it in an evidence bag and kept digging. 40 minutes later, the sheriff's snowplow appeared below the switchback. Eli Navarro stepped out before the blade finished pushing through the last drift. "You have a talent for standing where paperwork multiplies," he said. "Was this control work authorized?" "No." Then it was not weather. Eli looked uphill. It was still snow. Snow does not carry a transmitter. Jonah pointed out the control box. Eli climbed the service trail with a county technician, while Jonah waited beside the truck. They returned with a sealed equipment case and expressions that answered the question before either spoke. "The unit is licensed to Summit Honors Contractor," Eli said. "Reported stolen 5 days ago. By Mason. That is what the theft report says." Jonah showed him the blue stake. Eli bagged it separately. "You should stay out of this. I found the dog. You found evidence. That does not make you the investigation. It makes me the person someone expected to be on this road." Eli's jaw shifted. "Which is why I am telling you not to keep following a trail designed for you." Jonah looked at Roque. The shepherd stood beside the truck, staring uphill. "Sometimes the trail is the only warning you get." Eli did not argue. He followed Jonah to the cabin and photographed the property before leaving. He also gave a direct order. No travel north of town, no contact with Caleb Voss, and no attempt to enter Elk Needle. Jonah agreed to all 3. He meant it for nearly 2 hours. The cabin had belonged to his father, before it belonged to him. It sat above the basin on 6 acres of timber and meadow, the last private parcel between the county road and a protected watershed. The cedar siding had darkened with age. One chimney leaned a little west. The porch steps were uneven because Jonah's father believed level boards encouraged complacency. Inside, Jonah spread a blanket near the wood stove and removed the remaining chain from Rook's collar. She tolerated the bolt cutters but turned away when metal touched metal. Beneath the harness, her ribs showed through the coat more than they had at the clinic. He placed food beside the stove. Rook did not approach. Jonah moved the bowl toward the doorway. She still refused. Only then did he notice an old strip of blue painter's tape across the floor. He had laid it down months earlier while repairing a crack in the boards and never removed it. The bowl sat on the far side. Jonah pulled the tape away. Rook ate. The discovery should have felt useful. Instead, it made him imagine someone laying lines on snow concrete and doorways until obedience became fear. He called the number on the Summit Honor chip registry from a landline. A receptionist answered and asked him to return Rook immediately. Jonah said all requests should go through the sheriff. Mr. Voss is concerned for her safety, the receptionist said. Then he can explain the chain. There was a pause. Mr. Kerr was responsible for field animals. Was Rook trained to stop at painted lines? Another pause longer. I do not have access to training records. Who does? The line went dead. A vehicle arrived shortly before sunset. Jonah watched from the kitchen window as an older Subaru climbed the drive. The rear bumper carried 3 faded stickers. Save the San Juan's Trust data, not donors, and a cartoon goat wearing ski goggles. The woman who stepped out wore a red parka, wool cap, and snowshoes strapped over boots that looked older than the car. She carried a cardboard archive box against her chest. Rook rose but did not bark. Jonah opened the door without removing the chain lock. Jonah Mercer. Who is asking? Dr. Marion Sloan. Snow Science, retired. Not your veterinarian. Blackpine has become crowded with Miriams because parents in the 1950s lacked imagination. Jonah opened the door 2 inches farther. What do you want? To see the dog Mason trained and the paint you found under her feet. He did not ask how she knew. That answer was likely Eli, the clinic, or the town itself. You worked for Summit Honor, he said. I worked near Summit Honor. There is a difference that became expensive. Jonah let hair in. Rook watched the woman's snowshoes cross the threshold. Miriam Sloan stopped when she saw the dog. Hello, Rook, she said. The shepherd's ears rose. You know her. I knew her before someone taught her to fear paint. Miriam set the archive box on the table and removed her coat. She was 63, tall and narrow, with iron-gray hair braided down her back. The left side of her mouth pulled slightly lower when she spoke, a remnant of a stroke 2 years earlier. Her hands remained steady. Rook approached, smelled her glove, and stepped away. She remembers you, Jonah said. She remembers my pocket-carried dried liver. Miriam produced a small piece. Memory is often practical. Rook accepted the treat. Inside the box were topographic maps, snowpack reports, satellite images, and handwritten notes. Miriam spread them across Jonah's dining table in layers. Summit Honor asked me to evaluate 4 housing sites 7 years ago, she said. They were building cottages on donated land. The work was good. The sites were safe. Caleb listened when I told him where not to build. What changed? Money. Then language. Money changes language before it changes behavior. She placed 2 maps side by side. The first was dated 5 winters earlier. The second was current. Red avalanche hazard lines crossed the slopes above Blackpine. On the older map, Jonah's property sat outside the danger zone. On the newer map, the red boundary curved around his meadow and continued through 3 parcels owned by elderly veterans. The mountain did not move, Miriam said. The line did. Maps are revised. After new terrain data, vegetation loss, wildfire altered drainage, or documented slide behavior, none occurred here. She added a 3rd map. The red zone had shifted again, this time leaving a narrow corridor of apparently safe land running north to south. Jonah followed it with 1 finger. It crossed parcels already acquired by Summit Honor and ended at a mining access road. Who owns the mineral rights? He asked. Crown Meridian Resources owns options beneath 12 parcels. They cannot reach the deposit without surface access, and the corridor gives it to them. If the surrounding owners are forced to sell. Jonah looked at his property on the map. Miriam pointed to the slope above it. Your father refused 3 offers. After he died, Summit Honor offered to place the cabin in a veteran preservation trust. You refused that too. They wanted control. They wanted an easement. How do you know? Because I read the appendix no one else reads. She pulled another document from the box. It was a draft transfer agreement with Jonah's parcel number written in pencil. He studied the signature line. Blank. Mason gave you this. He gave me copies of many things. Then he stopped calling. When? 6 weeks ago. Jonah did not correct her. Caleb claimed Mason disappeared 6 days ago. The difference mattered. Miriam explained that she first challenged the revised maps 18 months earlier. She submitted reports to the County Planning Board, the State Geological Office, and Summit Honors Board. Caleb responded by hiring another consultant who declared her analysis unreliable. After her stroke, he framed every disagreement as evidence of decline. What did you do then? Jonah asked. I requested raw sensor data, and the files were missing. You went to law enforcement. The sheriff said a technical disagreement was not a crime. The state asked for proof of fraudulent intent. Crown Meridian threatened a defamation suit. I discovered that being correct and being believed are separate professions. Jonah looked at the maps again. Why come to me now? Because Rook was found with elk needle lead line and blue paint. Miriam opened a small metal case. Inside were paint samples on labeled glass slides. She held one beneath the lamp, then compared it with the blue flake Miriam Cole had placed in Jonah's copy envelope. The current county stakes use ultraviolet stable green, she said. Summit Honor used this blue epoxy only at elk needle because ordinary paint cracked in the wind. I specified the formula. Could it be from somewhere else? Anything could. But this pigment contains crushed mica from one discontinued supplier. If the dog has it under her nails, she was likely inside or near that station. Jonah remembered Rook staring north. Mason is there. Miriam's mouth tightened. Maybe. Or he left evidence there. Do not turn hope into a conclusion. The wood stove popped. Rook flinched, then settled again. Miriam pointed to a row of dates on the recent maps. There is another problem. These stakes were supposedly installed in August. The paint layer in the photographs shows frost cracking beneath it, meaning they were painted during winter and backdated to make the survey appear older. Can you prove that? Not from photographs. We need an original stake and a core sample from the mapped slope. Jonah placed the piece from the road on the table. Miriam turned it under the light. The broken end revealed 2 paint layers, blue over yellow. She smiled without warmth. Someone has been moving lines and repainting history. A knock sounded at the back door. Rook stood instantly. Jonah reached for the pistol, locked above the pantry, then stopped when Eli called his name from outside. The deputy entered carrying a sealed property bag. The control box from the slide, he said. Serial number matches equipment Mason signed out 3 weeks ago. Caleb said 6 days. Eli looked at Miriam Sloan, then at the maps. Why is she here? Because the mountain does not sign charity brochures, Miriam said. Eli ignored the remark. Jonah, I told you to stay away from this. I stayed in my house. You imported the investigation. Miriam folded her arms. Deputy, I attempted to give your office these maps 9 months ago, and I documented the complaint. You documented me as confused. Eli's face hardened. I documented that the county geologist disagreed with you. The county geologist now consults for Crown Meridian. The room went quiet. Eli looked down at the maps. For the next hour, he asked precise questions. Miriam answered without rushing. Jonah watched the deputy move from skepticism to discomfort, then to the careful neutrality of a man who had realized an earlier decision might have protected the wrong people. At the end, Eli collected the broken stake and promised to request a warrant for survey archives. Do not go to Elk Needle, he said again. What if the warrant takes 3 days? Jonah asked. Then it takes 3 days. Someone triggered a slide above my truck. That is exactly why you do not go. After Eli left, Miriam Sloan packed most of the maps, but left 1 copy of the corridor plan. You trust him? Jonah asked. I trust that he dislikes being wrong more than he likes Caleb. That is not trust. It is enough for tonight. The Subaru disappeared down the drive at dusk. Jonah heated beef stew and added warm water to Rook's food. She ate only when he sat on the floor several feet away. Halfway through the meal, she picked up one piece of kibble, carried it to him, and dropped it on his boot. Jonah looked at the offering. I have had better invitations. Rook returned to the bowl. A laugh escaped him before he could stop it. The sound surprised both of them. Rook lifted her head. Jonah shook his head and pushed the kibble back toward her. Keep your supplies. Later, he laid a new strip of blue painter's tape across the hallway. Rook saw it and stopped. Jonah stood on the far side without giving the signal. He waited. For nearly 5 minutes, she did not move. Then she placed one white-toed paw over the tape. Jonah said nothing. Rook crossed on her own. The moment was so small it would have looked meaningless to anyone else. To Jonah, it felt larger than the maps covering his table. At 9:17, the cabin lights went out. The generator did not start. Jonah checked the control panel and found the fuel line valve closed. He had filled the tank that morning and left the valve open. Rook stood beside the dark hallway, listening. Outside beyond the windows, the temperature had fallen below 0. Then Jonah saw a flashlight moving through the trees above the cabin. One beam, low to the ground, approaching the property line that had shifted on Miriam's map. Jonah left the cabin dark. He moved through the kitchen without using a flashlight and opened the back door by hand so the latch would not click. Rook stood beside him, body angled toward the trees. The beam outside had vanished, but a faint crunch of snow carried from the upper edge of the property. Stay, Rook's ears turned back. Jonah had not used Mason's signal. This was an ordinary command, and she obeyed it with visible reluctance. He stepped onto the porch. The cold struck harder, without the cabin lights dry enough to sting his nostrils. Snow reflected what little glow came from black pine below, turning the meadow into a dim silver field. Jonah followed the tree line uphill, keeping the cabin behind his right shoulder. A shape moved near the generator shed. He closed the distance quietly until his boot struck something hard beneath the powder. A black equipment case. The flashlight beam appeared behind him. Hands where I can see them. Eli Navarro stood 20 feet away with his service pistol aimed low. A second deputy approached from the drive. Jonah raised both hands. What are you doing here? Responding to an anonymous report that stolen explosives were brought to this property. Jonah looked down at the case. I just found it. That is what I was afraid you would say. The second deputy opened the case only after Eli photographed it. Inside lay 2 electronic detonators, a spool of orange lead line, and a handheld control unit marked with Summit Honor inventory labels. Jonah recognized the unit Caleb had held outside the community center. He said so. Eli's expression did not change. Your prints may be on it, the deputy said. Caleb handed me the same model during a county demonstration last spring. Did you tell anyone that before I opened the box? No. Then stop helping. The generator shed showed no forced entry. The fuel valve had been closed, but no usable footprints remained near it because wind had drifted snow against the wall. Tire tracks entered from the upper service road and ended where the road narrowed among trees. The storm had softened the tread pattern beyond identification. Miriam Sloane's maps lay spread across Jonah's table when deputies entered the cabin. The corridor plan survey notes and photograph of Elk Needle looked less like research than motive when placed beside stolen blasting equipment. Rook watched the search from the doorway. An electronic camera flashed. She dropped to the floor. Jonah moved toward her. Stay where you are, Eli said. She is frightened. So am I, Jonah. I am simply trained not to bite people. Rook did not bite. She crawled backward until the wall stopped her and kept her eyes on the equipment case. Eli read Jonah his rights, but did not handcuff him. He said the detention was temporary, while investigators verified ownership and checked the anonymous call. Jonah heard the legal care in every word. It did not change the fact that he was placed in the rear of a county vehicle while Caleb's equipment sat in his snow. As they pulled away, Jonah looked back through the glass. Rook stood in the cabin doorway beside the second deputy. The dog had crossed the blue tape without a command. She could not cross the distance between them. At the sheriff's office, Jonah waited in an interview room, painted the same pale green as military clinics. A clock ticked loudly enough to become part of his breathing. Eli entered with Sheriff Helen Ward, a 60-year-old former prosecutor who wore reading glasses on a chain and treated emotional displays as unreliable witnesses. She placed 3 photographs on the table. The first showed the detonators at Jonah's cabin. The second showed Jonah holding an identical control unit at Summit Honor's spring safety demonstration. Caleb stood beside him in the background. The third showed Mason Kerr signing equipment out from the Foundation storage room 3 weeks earlier. The anonymous caller knew where to direct us, Helen said. The equipment is real. The inventory numbers are real. Your connection to the dispute is public. So arrest Caleb for being photographed near his own equipment, for knowing I found the wire before I told him. You did tell him. Jonah looked at Eli. The deputy did not defend him. Helen continued. You accused him in front of 50 people. The next day, stolen material appears on your land. That can mean he framed you. It can also mean you took it to support an accusation you had already made. I found Rook chained to his tower, an abandoned county tower, with his line signed out to Mason Kerr. Every fact returned to Mason. That was the strength of Caleb's story. He did not need Jonah to look guilty forever. He only needed Mason to remain the most convenient explanation. Helen slid another document across the table. It was a temporary animal custody petition filed by Summit Honor. They claim Rook is trained property needed for an ongoing safety program, she said. They also claim you are using her in a personal dispute. She was injured under their ownership. The judge will consider that. When? This afternoon. Jonah leaned back. The old instinct to push harder rose in him. It had always felt like integrity while he was doing it. Only later did he see how often anger had chosen the terrain for him. What about the road slide? The control box was signed out to Mason. What about the blue stake? Paint analysis is pending. Miriam Sloane's maps. Helen removed her glasses. Dr. Sloane called this office at 7 this morning and withdrew her allegation of deliberate map fraud. Jonah stared at her. What? She said her conclusions exceeded what the available data could support. The clock continued ticking. For a moment, Jonah was back in a hearing room 10 years earlier, waiting for Mason to walk through a door and confirm what both men had seen. The door had remained closed. A lawyer read Mason's revised statement. The report was incomplete. The records were open to interpretation. He could not support Jonah's conclusion. Different room. Same shape. Did she explain why Jonah asked? No, Jonah looked toward the one-way glass. She was threatened. Maybe, Helen said. Or maybe you heard what you wanted because she gave your suspicion a technical vocabulary. Eli flinched slightly at the sentence. Jonah saw it. You believe her maps, Jonah said. I believe they deserve review. Then why am I in this room? Because evidence was found on your land, and unlike you, I do not get to choose which facts feel loyal. The interview ended without charges. Jonah was released pending forensic results, but the county retained his truck phone, satellite communicator, and the evidence bags from the tower. Rook was gone when he returned to the cabin with Eli. A court order authorized Summit Honor to take temporary custody under veterinary supervision. Miriam Cole had objected, but the foundation produced training records, insurance documents, and a facility license. They moved her to the Ridge Center, Eli said. Not the main kennel. A private recovery room. You let Caleb take the only living witness. She is a dog, Jonah. She is afraid of his equipment. That is not legal identification. Jonah turned on him. You know what he is doing. I know someone placed explosives at your cabin. I know, Doctor. Sloane withdrew her complaint. I know Mason signed equipment out. I know you publicly threatened Caleb's reputation and ignored every warning I gave you. I did not threaten him. You stood at his fundraiser and told donors to stop giving money until he explained himself. He needed to explain himself. Maybe. But you made sure he knew exactly which evidence frightened you. The words landed because they were true. Jonah entered the cabin. Rook's bowl remained beside the stove. One piece of kibble lay near his boot where she had dropped it the night before. The strip of blue tape still crossed the hallway. The house felt larger without her. Eli stood in the doorway. I am trying to keep you from becoming another piece of Caleb's defense, he said. Then stop helping him. The deputy's expression closed. If you approach the Ridge Center, you will be arrested for violating the custody order. He left. Jonah restored power to the generator and spent the next hour examining the cabin. He found one scratch on the rear window latch and a faint smear of black grease beneath the sill. Nothing enough to prove entry. Whoever planted the case understood how little evidence a mountain property preserved after snow and wind. At noon, his landline rang. No one spoke when he answered. He heard a low mechanical hum, then 2 electronic beeps. The same rhythm as Caleb's control unit. The line disconnected. Jonah called Eli. The deputy said the call could not be traced without a warrant, and warned him again not to act alone. At 1:30, a county vehicle delivered notice that Jonah's cabin had been designated for emergency hazard review. A revised avalanche map showed the red danger boundary crossing the porch. The notice required temporary evacuation within 48 hours. Miriam's line had moved again. Jonah drove a borrowed truck to her house despite the order to stay uninvolved. The small home sat near the closed railway, spur its roof covered in solar panels and weather instruments. He knocked until his knuckles hurt. Miriam opened the door only 6 inches. Her face looked tired. "You withdrew the complaint," he said. "Yes. Why?" "My conclusions were not adequately supported." The sentence sounded memorized. "They threatened your pension." "No." "Your house." "No." "Then what?" "What?" Miriam's left hand tightened around the door. "Go home, Jonah." "I have to leave home." The map changed this morning. For one instant, anger broke through her fear. Then a vehicle passed behind him. Miriam looked toward the street and closed the door. Jonah stood on the porch while snow began again. He understood the message, but not the reason. At the Ridge Center, Rook had been placed in a heated room, separated from the main kennel by a concrete corridor. Caleb told staff the dog needed quiet. He instructed them to avoid metal bowls, electronic door tones, and sudden movement. The instructions sounded compassionate. They also ensured no one would ask why he already knew her triggers. A young technician named Dana Ruiz carried Rook's evening meal into the room. Dana was 26, a former Army medic who worked at Summit Honor while studying veterinary rehabilitation. She had seen Rook with Mason before he disappeared. The dog had once followed him through construction sites, meetings, and snowfields without hesitation. Now Rook stood against the back wall. Blue tape marked a cleaning boundary across the floor. Dana set the bowl on the near side. Rook did not eat. "Come on, girl," Dana said. The dog stared toward the corridor wall. A maintenance worker tested an avalanche beacon in the storage room next door. The device gave 3 rising chirps. Rook's body dropped. Dana reached for the radio. Before she could call anyone, Rook lunged, not at the door, not at the technician, but at the wall. Her claws scraped the concrete beneath a faded facility map. She dug until one nail bled, then stepped back and looked at Dana. The beacon chirped again. Rook struck the wall with both front paws. Dana removed the map. Behind it, someone had drawn an old service route in pencil. The line ran north from the Ridge Center through a maintenance tunnel across the closed pass and ended at a small square labeled Elk Needle Instrument Shelter. Dana stared at the mark. Rook pressed her nose to the square. Then she looked toward the door, waiting for someone to understand. Dana did not call Caleb. She photographed the drawing with her personal phone, then covered it again and carried Rook's untouched bowl back into the corridor. At the staff desk, the internal camera showed Caleb entering the facility through the rear door, even though he had told everyone he was attending a board meeting in Denver. Dana slipped the phone into her pocket. For the first time since taking the job, she understood why Mason had once told her that good organizations could become dangerous when protecting the organization mattered more than protecting the people inside it. Dana Ruiz called Eli Navarro from the laundry room because it was the only place in the Ridge Center without a camera. She kept her voice low and gave him 3 facts. Rook had reacted to an old service route behind a wall map. Caleb Voss had entered through the rear door while claiming to be out of town, and the route ended at Elk Needle. Then she said, "I think Mason is still alive." Eli did not tell her she was wrong. He told her to photograph everything, touch nothing else, and find a reason to leave the building with Rook if Caleb tried to move the dog. At the sheriff's office, Jonah sat across from Helen Ward while snow struck the windows in dry bursts. The sheriff had just returned his phone but not his truck. Forensic technicians found no usable print on the planted equipment, except Jonah's old partial impression from the spring demonstration and 2 gloved smears. The anonymous caller had used a prepaid line. The evidence did not clear him. It weakened the case against him enough that Helen could no longer pretend the timing was ordinary. Eli entered and placed Dana's photograph of the hidden route on the table. Jonah leaned forward. The pencil line did not follow the public service road. It used an old maintenance tunnel beneath the ridge, one Jonah remembered from childhood. The tunnel carried power and instrument cables before a rockfall sealed the west entrance. Its east opening lay behind the Ridge Center property. Mason knew that route, Jonah said. Caleb knows it too, Eli replied. Helen looked at the weather display. The pass closes at 6. We will request a search warrant for the Ridge Center and Elk Needle. How long? Best case, 2 hours. Worst. The judge is in Grand Junction, and the storm is interfering with the secure connection. Jonah stood. Helen pointed at the chair. Sit down. If Mason is alive, 2 hours matters. If you enter without authority, every defense lawyer in Colorado gets a gift. Then enter for a rescue. We need an objective basis to believe a person is in immediate danger. Dana's photograph showed a pencil line, not a body. The door opened again. Miriam Sloan stepped inside, carrying a plastic survey tube and breathing hard from the stairs. I withdrew my complaint because Caleb sent me a photograph of Owen Price's furnace shut-off authorization, she said. The foundation owns the propane contract for every cottage. He said an audit would freeze payments until spring. Jonah looked at her. You let him use them. I bought time. By making me look insane. Yes, the honesty stopped his next words. Miriam placed the tube on Helen's desk. Inside were original field maps, bearing Mason's notes, 2 sets of survey coordinates, and a flash drive. I went to Summit Honor this morning and withdrew the allegation in person, she said. While Caleb celebrated my surrender, I copied the archive index from his terminal. The recent maps reference snow cores stored at Elk Needle. If those cores exist, they can show the slope layers do not match the hazard reports. Helen examined the documents. How did you remove these? They were mine before Caleb locked them away. That is not a legal answer. It is the one you have. Eli's radio sounded. Dana's voice came through, broken by static. Caleb is loading Rook into the North Transport. He says the dog is being moved to Denver. A second voice ordered her away from the vehicle. Then the transmission ended. Helen reached for her coat. That is enough for emergency intervention, she said. They arrived at the Ridge Center 12 minutes later. The North Transport van sat running near the service gate. Dana stood beside it with blood on one sleeve where Rook had torn through her own bandage while resisting the crate. Caleb faced the dog from several yards away, holding the same black control unit Jonah had seen at the fundraiser. The unit was not connected to the van. It was connected to a beacon clipped inside the crate. Each time Caleb pressed the button, the device gave 2 beeps. Rook flattened and refused to move. Jonah stepped through the gate. Caleb's eyes found him immediately. You are violating a court order, he said. So are you. The dog is being transferred for specialized care. With an avalanche beacon in the crate, Caleb lowered the control unit. Behavioral desensitization. Dana laughed, once sharp and unbelieving. You never mentioned a treatment plan. Helen Ward approached with 2 deputies and presented the emergency order. Caleb read it carefully, then handed over the control unit without resistance. That composure frightened Jonah more than anger would have. Rook crossed the yard toward him in an uneven run. She did not stop at the yellow loading boundary. She struck Jonah's chest with both front paws and nearly knocked him backward. He caught her around the ribs. I came back, he said. Rook pressed her nose against his watch. Caleb watched the gesture. Mason used to do that, he said quietly. Touch the dog's nose to the watch before field work. Jonah looked at him. You know more about her training than you claimed. I know many things I did not consider relevant to your accusations. Helen ordered the building secured. The hidden route began behind the wall map and descended through a locked maintenance door into a concrete tunnel. Fresh boot marks crossed dust on the floor. A utility sled had recently moved through, leaving narrow tracks beneath electrical cables. The tunnel smelled of cold stone oil and something medicinal. Rook entered willingly until a blue stripe appeared across the floor. She stopped. Jonah waited beside her. He did not give the signal. Rook looked up at him, then crossed on her own. The tunnel rose for nearly a mile. At the sealed rockfall, someone had opened a narrow passage through old debris. The group continued single file. Eli, first Jonah and Rook behind him, Helen, Miriam, and 2 rescue volunteers carrying medical gear. Near the east opening, they found an empty food wrapper dated 5 weeks earlier. A blood-stained bandage lay beneath a pipe. The stain was dry, but not old enough to belong to the abandoned station. Outside, the storm had turned the world white. Elk Needle stood on a ridge above them, a low metal building half buried by drifting snow. Its official entrance had been welded shut. Rook ignored it and moved around the south wall to a ventilation hatch covered by a sheet of plywood. The plywood was fastened from inside. Jonah knocked. No answer. He knocked again, using the rhythm Mason once used on team room doors. 2. Pause. 1. Pause. 2. Something moved behind the panel. A man's voice, thin and hoarse, said, "That better not be Voss." Jonah closed his eyes. "Mason." Silence followed. Then a laugh came through the wall, weak enough to sound painful. "You took your time." They removed the panel and found Mason Kerr inside the instrument shelter. He looked older than 52. A beard covered most of his face, and his left ankle was wrapped in improvised splints. He wore 3 coats, none fully dry. A propane heater burned at its lowest setting, beside stacks of sensor logs, food packets, and sealed snow core containers. Rook reached him first. She stopped at the edge of a black rubber mat. Mason raised 2 fingers, palm down, and drew them inward. "Take the line." Rook crossed, pressed her entire body against him, and made a sound Jonah had never heard from her before, half whine, half breath, the release of an animal that had been carrying a command longer than it understood. Mason buried both hands in her coat. "I sent you south," he whispered. "How did you end up at the tower?" Rook licked the side of his face. Jonah stood in the doorway. For 10 years he had imagined what he would say if Mason ever appeared again. Every version contained accusation. None contained a wounded man kneeling beside a dog in a frozen station. "You signed the maps," Jonah said. Mason looked up. Yes, the answer came without defense. Miriam closed the door against the wind. Rescue volunteers began examining Mason's ankle, blood pressure, and temperature while he explained. Caleb's foundation had been running out of money for 2 winters. The housing cottages cost more to heat and maintain than donations covered. Crown Meridian offered a rescue. Millions in exchange for land access and favorable hazard classifications. At first, Caleb asked Mason to adjust only one boundary around an unoccupied parcel. Then another. When Mason refused the 3rd change, Caleb showed him a list of cottages whose propane contracts would be canceled within days. Owen Price's name was first. "I signed," Mason said. "Told myself I was keeping old men alive." "You told yourself the lie was temporary," Miriam said. "I told myself many useful things." Jonah heard the echo of his own certainty and hated it. Mason began copying original maps and retrieving snow cores that contradicted the revisions. He planned to take them to the state inspector. Caleb discovered the archive access and accused him of theft. During a confrontation at Elk Needle, an unauthorized charge triggered a slab release. Mason survived inside the shelter but injured his ankle. Caleb's men sealed the tunnel and removed the station radio. "How did you eat?" Eli asked. "Emergency stores." Rook found the tunnel after the slide. She came back twice with food from the Ridge Center. "Why did she leave?" Jonah asked. "I sent her with a drive in her harness." Jonah checked the cut seam. "Empty." "They caught her," Mason said. "Someone cut the patch, took the drive, and used the beacon command to keep her inside marked zones. She escaped again, or they dumped her. I do not know which." "Why the old tower?" "It was our rally point for field teams. If she could not reach town, she was trained to wait there. The chain had been added afterward." Mason looked at Jonah's watch. "She found you. She recognized the signal. I kept it in her training." Why Mason's eyes lowered. "Because I hoped one day I would be brave enough to use it again." The old anger moved through Jonah, but it no longer fit the shape he had carried. Mason had betrayed him. That remained true. Mason had also been threatened with the loss of his sister's medical coverage through a Navy family support program connected to the commander under investigation. He withdrew his testimony and spent 10 years trying to build good work on top of a failure he never confessed. I should have stood beside you, Mason said. I did not. Caleb learned exactly which part of me to press because I had already shown him. Jonah turned away. Forgiveness did not arrive. Understanding did, and it was heavier. Miriam opened one of the core containers. The layered snow and ice inside had been dated, photographed, and sealed. If preserved, the samples could prove the official stability reports were fabricated. Mason pointed toward a bank of old monitors. Caleb scheduled a control sequence for tomorrow at sunrise, he said. 3 charges above this station. The blast will bury the shelter and destroy the remaining cores. Can he trigger them remotely? Eli asked. He can from the north bunker. Then we size the bunker. Mason shook his head. The access road crosses Crown Meridian land. They will delay a warrant. Caleb only needs an hour. Helen's radio crackled. A county dispatcher reported that Summit Honor had announced an emergency heating shortage. Residents in 4 cottages were being told their propane deliveries might stop unless the foundation's accounts remained unfrozen. Caleb had tied the veteran's survival to his own protection. Jonah looked at the snow cores, then at Mason. The truth was finally in front of him, alive and imperfect. Outside, somewhere beyond the storm, a warning siren sounded once from the North Ridge. Sunrise was still 12 hours away. Caleb had begun the sequence early. The first warning siren ended before its echo reached the valley. Mason pushed himself upright, despite the rescue volunteer's hand on his shoulder. That was the arming tone, he said. The charges are not live yet. How long? Eli asked. Depends on the program. 30 minutes if he uses the standard delay. Less if he overrides it. Helen Ward called the county emergency manager and ordered the North Ridge evacuated. The answer came back that the official hazard map showed no occupied structures below the proposed control zone. The map was false. 3 Summit Honor cottages sat beneath the old line, including Owen Price's home. Caleb had moved the red boundary away from them on paper while using the threat of avalanche designation to seize other properties. If the slope released now, the people he claimed to protect would be directly below it. The rescue team divided. Helen and 2 volunteers would bring Mason and the snow cores down through the tunnel. Eli would coordinate evacuation from the valley. Jonah would take the maintenance snowcat parked behind the station and reach the north bunker by the upper traverse. You are not law enforcement, Helen said. I know the controls. You know old controls. Mason knows the current sequence. Mason tried to stand again and nearly fell. He cannot go, Helen said. Rook moved to Jonah's side. Mason looked at the dog, then at Jonah. The bunker has a mechanical cutoff cable beneath the east platform. Rook knows the search command for insulated line. Jonah's jaw tightened. She has done enough. So have you, Mason said. That has never stopped you. The sentence almost became an argument. There was no time. Jonah took Mason's handheld radio and the station's paper control diagram. Rook climbed into the snowcat beside him without hesitation. He drove into the storm while Eli relayed evacuation orders below. The upper traverse was little more than a shelf cut across the mountain. Wind erased its edges. Snow struck the windshield sideways, and the wipers froze at the hinges. Jonah kept one hand on the wheel and one near the manual brake. Mason's voice came through the radio. First junction, stay left. The right fork crosses a loaded bowl. Your maps say right is safe. My maps are why we are here. Jonah took the left fork. Half a mile later, an explosion flashed above the ridge. The sound arrived a second afterward, deep and physical. Snow fractured across the upper face in a white line. Jonah accelerated toward a stand of spruce as the slab began to move. The edge of the slide hit the snowcat sideways. Metal screamed against rock. The vehicle tipped onto its right track, then slammed back down. Jonah's shoulder struck the door. Rook was thrown against the seat harness, but remained secured. The engine died. Snow covered the lower half of the windows. Jonah Mason's voice crackled. We are upright. The second charge will release the east bowl. How long? No way to know. Jonah forced the door open against packed snow. The bunker stood 300 yards uphill, a concrete rectangle beneath antenna masts. Between them lay the east bowl. They would have to cross before the second blast. Rook stepped from the snowcat and froze at an orange boundary flag. Jonah looked at her. No signal. Rook lifted the white-toed paw and crossed. They climbed. The wind flattened Jonah's coat against his body. His injured shoulder burned each time he planted the climbing pole. Rook moved ahead, then returned whenever the distance grew too wide. Near the bunker, she stopped at a buried cable marker and scraped snow from it. Good girl. The bunker door opened. Caleb Voss stepped outside, holding a flare pistol in one hand and the black control unit in the other. He wore insulated field gear and a radio headset. No friendly coat. No donor room patience. Behind him, screens glowed with slope diagrams and countdown timers. "Do not come closer," he said. Jonah stopped 20 feet away. Rook stood beside him, body low. "You are about to bury 3 cottages," Jonah said. "The evacuation is underway." "Because we called it?" "Because I knew you would." Caleb lowered the flare pistol slightly. "The cottages are empty by now. The station will be destroyed." "No one dies." Mason almost did. A flicker crossed Caleb's face. Mason chose to stay. "You sealed the tunnel. I contained a man who was prepared to collapse, the only organization keeping 57 veterans housed. You changed the maps for a mining company. I changed access to land." Caleb's voice rose for the first time. "Land, Jonah. Trees, rock-old cabins, owned by people whose heirs live in other states and visit twice a decade. Crown Meridian's money kept furnaces running. It paid for dialysis, trips, roof repairs, wheelchair ramps. You saw the room yesterday. Those people are alive because I made a decision no donor was brave enough to make. You decided who would lose their homes. I decided whose property could carry the cost. That is not charity. No, it is survival." The second timer on the bunker screen moved below 4 minutes. Mason's voice came through Jonah's radio. "Find the junction box." Caleb heard it. "So he is alive," he said. "He will testify. He will confess. His signatures are on every report. His authorization released every charge. By the time lawyers finish with him, the cottages will be empty and the foundation dead. Then it dies." Caleb looked genuinely wounded. "You would sacrifice all of them to preserve your clean conscience." Jonah felt the accusation because part of it was true. 10 years earlier, he had demanded truth without understanding what Mason believed he stood to lose. The report still needed exposure. The equipment logs still had been altered. But Jonah had allowed moral certainty to become a place where he did not have to see anyone else's fear. He would not make the same mistake now. "The residents keep their homes," he said. "The foundation changes hands." "With what money?" Jonah removed the brass compass from his coat. "My land closes the corridor." Caleb's eyes narrowed. "If I transfer it into a public conservation trust before Crown Meridian records the easement, their access plan fails. The county can freeze the sale without freezing the housing accounts. You would give up your father's cabin. I would give up the right to use it as a weapon against everyone below." Caleb laughed, but the sound held no humor. "You think one signature solves this? No. It gives the state time to separate the cottages from your company." The timer reached 3 minutes. Caleb raised the control unit. "You always believed choosing loss made you honorable." Jonah slipped the compass back into his pocket. "No, I believed making other people lose proved I was right." Rook moved sideways. Caleb aimed the flare pistol at the snow near her feet. "Keep the dog still." Jonah's hand lifted. Rook stopped. A low vibration passed through the slope, the east bowl settling under its own weight. Caleb pressed a button. Nothing happened. He looked at the control unit. Miriam's voice came through the open emergency frequency. "The north transmitter has been isolated. Local trigger only." Caleb turned toward the bunker. Jonah moved. The flare fired. Red light struck the snow beside his boot and hissed into steam. Caleb retreated inside and slammed the steel door. The electronic lock engaged. Rook barked once sharp and focused. "Line," Jonah said. "Not take the line. Search line." Rook lowered her nose and moved beneath the east platform. Snow covered a bank of cables, entering the concrete wall. She ignored the thin sensor wires and began digging beside a thicker, insulated conduit. Jonah dropped to his knees and cleared snow with both hands. The countdown continued inside. 2 minutes. Rook found the junction box. Its cover was secured with 4 bolts, and a blue-painted stripe crossed the latch. She stopped before it. Jonah did not signal. Rook stepped over the stripe and struck the box with one paw. He used the multi-tool from his belt to remove the bolts. The first turned. The second was frozen. His left shoulder failed when he forced it. Inside the bunker, Caleb activated the backup generator. The timer resumed on the external warning panel. 90 seconds. Mason spoke through the radio. Cut the black mechanical cable, not the yellow power lead. Jonah broke the frozen bolt with the climbing pole. The cover fell open. Black, yellow, red, and white cables filled the box. Rook pulled at Jonah's sleeve. A section of slope above them cracked. The third charge was not waiting for the timer. Caleb had armed it manually. Jonah reached for the black cable. The mountain released. Snow struck the bunker roof like surf against a ship. The platform twisted. Jonah lost his footing and slid toward the edge. Rook lunged, caught the canvas sleeve of his coat, and held long enough for him to drive one boot against the concrete footing. The black cable lay 6 inches beyond his reach. He tore the brass compass from his pocket, opened the metal case, and jammed its edge beneath the cable. The old hinge snapped. The sharpened rim cut through the outer insulation. Jonah pulled once. The cable separated. The countdown stopped at 23 seconds. Inside, the bunker alarms changed tone. The steel door released automatically under safety protocol. Caleb came out with the control unit raised, saw the severed cable, and ran for the west traverse. Jonah started after him. Then Mason shouted through the radio. The station door collapsed. "I am trapped behind the inner frame." Jonah stopped. Caleb disappeared into the storm. For one, Heartbeat Anger offered the easier choice. Chase the man. End the threat. Prove the victory with his own hands. Rook turned downhill toward Elk Needle. Jonah followed the dog. They reached the station as Eli and the rescue team fought a twisted metal door. A section of roof had dropped across the entrance. Mason was visible through a narrow gap pinned by a support beam, but conscious. Rook crawled beneath the beam first and found the emergency release cable on the far wall. Jonah used her harness line to pull a rescue strap through. Together they shifted the beam enough for Eli to drag Mason free. Caleb's escape lasted 12 minutes. Miriam had opened the rescue frequency to the state emergency network before the confrontation. Every word from the bunker, Caleb's admission that he changed land, access his claim that the cottages justified the decision, and his command sequence had been recorded. A state patrol snowmobile intercepted him at the lower traverse after he tried to cross a closed slope. Jonah did not see the arrest. He sat in the snow beside Mason while rescue workers splinted the injured ankle again. Rook lay between them, exhausted, her head resting across both men's boots. Mason looked at the broken compass in Jonah's hand. "Your father will haunt you for that." He would complain about the tool choice. He would say you ruined good brass doing a knife's job. Jonah almost smiled. Below them, Black Pine's cottages still had heat. Elk Needle still held the snow cores. Caleb was alive to answer for what he had done. None of it felt like winning. The transfer document for Jonah's land waited on Helen Ward's secure tablet. He signed it with a numb finger before the storm cleared, placing the cabin and 6 acres into an irrevocable public trust. The screen asked him to confirm. Jonah turned the broken compass lid 3 times out of habit. Then he pressed yes. Before the rescue sled carried Mason downhill, Eli placed Caleb's control unit inside an evidence bag and photographed the severed mechanical cable. Miriam collected the external warning log, which showed the sequence had been changed twice after the evacuation began. The record mattered because it proved Caleb had not merely continued a scheduled operation, he had adjusted the timing while knowing people were moving below the slope. Jonah watched each item receive a number and seal. For once, he did not need to force the truth forward. Other hands were carrying it now. The hearing took place 6 weeks later in the Black Pine Community Center, beneath the same white lights Caleb Voss had used for the Winter Home Fund. The donation banner was gone. In its place stood a state seal, 2 rows of folding tables, and a microphone that squealed whenever anyone adjusted it. Snow pressed against the windows in soft ridges. The cottages on the north side of town remained heated under an emergency management order, though their future had not yet been decided. Caleb entered through a side door wearing a dark suit and no overcoat. 2 state investigators walked behind him. He was not handcuffed. His attorneys had argued that restraints would prejudice the public hearing, and the judge agreed. For a few seconds, Caleb looked like the man Blackpine remembered. The silver hair, the measured posture, the face that had appeared beside repaired roofs and new furnaces. Then he saw Rook. The German shepherd lay beside Jonah in the back row. Her foreleg had healed, though cold mornings still made her favor it. The fur beneath the old collar had begun to grow back in a narrow, dark band. She watched Caleb enter, but did not flatten herself, retreat, or search for a painted line. She simply watched him. Caleb looked away first. The state did not ask the community to decide guilt. Criminal charges would be tried elsewhere. The purpose of the hearing was to determine what happened to Summit Honor's housing land, contracts, and public grants while the case moved forward. Numbers filled the first hour. Accounts frozen. Propane invoices unpaid. Maintenance reserves transferred to shell companies. Crown Meridian payments disguised as consulting fees. The figures were large enough to make several people in the room stop taking notes. Then the residents spoke. Owen Price came first. He wore his best blue shirt and used only one cane because he said two made him look like he planned to stay all day. He faced Caleb rather than the board. "You put heat in my house," Owen said. "That is true." Caleb's shoulders lowered slightly. "You sent a crew when my furnace cracked in January. You found medicine when the pharmacy said the road was closed. You sat with me after my wife died because I had no one else that night." The room remained silent. Owen tightened both hands around the cane. "And then you used every good thing you did to make us afraid of asking what else you were doing." Caleb's attorney shifted, but Caleb did not look away. "You told us the foundation would fail if we questioned the land deals," Owen continued. "You told Miriam she would put us in the cold. You told Mason one signature would keep old men alive. You made gratitude into a debt we could never finish paying." Caleb leaned toward the microphone at his table. "I never wanted any of you harmed." Owen nodded. "That is what makes it worse." The judge reminded him not to debate the witness. Caleb sat back. Dana Ruiz testified next. She described the beacon in Rook's transport crate, the hidden service route, and Caleb's unannounced entrance through the rear door. Her voice shook only once, when she admitted she had ignored smaller warning signs for months, because Summit Honor paid for her school and allowed her to work with injured veterans. "I thought loyalty meant protecting the place that gave me a chance," she said. "I did not understand that the place was asking me to protect it from the truth." Miriam Sloan presented the map sequence. She explained each altered line in plain language, never using 3 words where one would do. When Caleb's attorney implied her stroke had affected her judgment, she removed her glasses and looked at him for a long moment. "My mouth moves differently," she said. "The mountain does not." A few people laughed. The attorney did not ask the question again. Mason testified from a chair near the front. His ankle remained in a rigid brace. Rook rose when he approached the microphone, but Jonah touched her shoulder and she settled again. Mason did not call himself a whistleblower. He listed each report he had signed. He named the dates, parcels, and consequences. He explained the pressure Caleb applied and the excuses he used to make his own choices feel temporary. "I was threatened," Mason said. "I was also afraid. Neither statement erases my signature." Caleb watched him with an expression Jonah could not read. When Mason finished, he turned toward the residents. "Some of you may lose trust in every map board and promise connected to this place because I helped make the wrong ones look official. I cannot ask you to forgive that. I can only help repair what can still be repaired and accept what cannot." He returned to his seat without looking at Jonah. The state board announced its decision near sunset. Summit Honor Foundation would be placed under independent receivership. Housing assets would be separated from its land acquisition division. Emergency funds would remain available for heat medicine and repairs. Crown Meridian's easement options were suspended, pending criminal and civil review. No resident would be evicted because of the frozen accounts. Caleb was removed from all authority over the organization he founded. The judge asked whether he wished to speak before the order was entered. Caleb stood. For the first time, he looked tired rather than controlled. "My brother died in a trailer with a broken heater," he said. The county knew. The Veterans Office knew. The church knew. Everyone had a form, a waiting list, or a reason the problem belonged to someone else. "I built Summit Honor because I promised no one in this basin would die that way again." His voice roughened, and for a while, No one did. No one interrupted him. When the money failed, Crown Meridian offered a choice. I believed the people in those cottages mattered more than abandoned land and legal boundaries. Then the boundaries kept moving. Every time I crossed one, the next looked smaller. He looked toward Jonah. You would have let the foundation die. Jonah remained seated. No, he said. I would have let it become something you no longer controlled. Caleb closed his eyes briefly. That was the mistake he had never been able to make. Saving people had become indistinguishable from being the person who saved them. The state investigators approached after the hearing. Caleb's attorneys objected, but the arrest warrant had already been issued on charges of fraud, evidence tampering, reckless endangerment, unlawful use of explosive systems, and conspiracy to coerce property transfers. One investigator asked Caleb to place his hands behind his back. The metal cuffs clicked. Rook's ears moved at the sound, but she did not flinch. Caleb looked at the dog. I never ordered anyone to hurt her, he said. Jonah believed him. That did not make Caleb innocent. It meant the cruelty had spread through the machinery he built until he no longer knew every hand using it. Rook stood and pressed one shoulder against Jonah's knee. Caleb was led from the room. Outside snow covered the steps where donors had gathered 6 weeks earlier. There were no cameras waiting, only residents leaving slowly, uncertain what to call the ending of something that had once saved them. Owen Price stopped beside Jonah. You were still wrong at the fundraiser, he said. Jonah looked at him. You said we should stop giving before you knew whether the cottages could survive it. Owen adjusted his cane. Caleb being guilty does not make every choice you made wise. No, Jonah said. It does not. Owen nodded, satisfied. Then he bent as far as his back allowed and offered Rook a piece of dried beef from his coat pocket. Dog looks smarter than both of you. She has a low standard of comparison, Mason said from behind them. Owen glanced at his brace. You are included. For the first time since Elk Needle, Jonah and Mason laughed at the same thing. It did not repair 10 years. It opened 1 minute that did not belong to them. By March, the maps on the wall of the old fire station had changed again. This time every revision carried 3 signatures. A state geologist, a county emergency officer, and a resident representative from the affected land. The original field data remained available for public review. No charity company or single consultant could move a hazard boundary alone. Miriam Sloan supervised the first training session for younger surveyors. She arrived with 4 binders, 2 thermoses, and the expectation that everyone had already read the material. When one technician asked whether she planned to retire again, Miriam told him she would consider it when the mountain stopped producing weather. Dana became the rehabilitation coordinator for the Housing Trust. She refused the title of director and accepted only after the receiver agreed that staff could report safety concerns outside the chain of command. Eli Navarro led the criminal evidence review. His report named the anonymous call, the planted equipment, the delayed warrant, and the office's earlier failure to investigate Miriam's maps. At the county meeting, someone praised his honesty. Eli said honesty after a mistake was not the same as avoiding the mistake. Mason worked at a folding table in the fire station 3 afternoons each week. His job was to rebuild the survey archive parcel by parcel, placing original readings beside every altered report. He did not receive a salary during the criminal review. He did not complain. Jonah joined him on Tuesdays. At first, they spoke only about coordinates, dates, and missing files. Mason asked no questions about Jonah's marriage. Jonah asked none about the 10 years Mason spent trying to make good work cover a bad choice. One afternoon, Mason found the old cold water training inquiry in a box of personal records Jonah had brought from the cabin. The folder lay between them. I kept a copy of my first statement, Mason said. Jonah did not look up. The one you withdrew? Yes. Why? I thought one day I would send it to you. You did not. No, Mason waited. Jonah closed the map they were reviewing. I spent years believing you chose them over me. I chose fear over both of us. That is not better. I know. The room held the answer without trying to soften it. Jonah opened the folder. He read the original statement once, then placed it in the public archive with Mason's revised one. Both stay, he said. Mason nodded. That was not forgiveness. It was a refusal to let either version disappear. Rook spent those afternoons beneath the table. She no longer slept facing the door. Sometimes her injured ear twitched when the old heating pipes knocked, but she did not wake. The Housing Trust received enough emergency grants to keep every cottage open through winter. Crown Meridian withdrew from the access agreement and later faced a separate investigation into its consultants and payments. The company announced that the misconduct belonged to individuals who no longer represented its values. Miriam read the statement aloud and said, "Corporations developed values at approximately the same speed rocks developed opinions." The trust converted Jonah's 6 acres into the Mercer Ridge Conservation and Working Dog Center. The name embarrassed Jonah, so the board approved it while he was absent. The cabin became a small field office and temporary residence for veterans working with injured service dogs. The meadow remained protected. The access corridor Crown Meridian needed could never be sold, leased, or mortgaged. Jonah received no payment. He moved into a modest rental above the old hardware store in town. The apartment had low ceilings, unreliable hot water, and no view of the mountains unless he leaned out the kitchen window. For the first month, he woke each morning, reaching for the sound of wind against the cabin shutters. The loss was not symbolic. It was inconvenient, permanent, and sometimes painful. That made it real. People in Black Pine began inviting Jonah to things again. He declined many invitations. He accepted enough. Owen taught him a card game with rules that changed whenever Owen began losing. Dana asked him to help build quiet entry kennels at the new center. Eli stopped by the hardware store for coffee and never called it friendship. Mason came to dinner once. They burned the stew because neither man remembered to lower the heat while arguing about whether Jonah's father had cheated at compass drills. Rook ate the parts that fell on the floor and considered the evening successful. The conversation ended early. Mason stood at the apartment door with his coat on. "I am not asking us to return to what we were," he said. "Good, I do not think it exists." "No," Mason looked down at Rook. "But I would like to know what comes after it." Jonah opened the door. "Tuesday," he said. "The East Basin maps are still wrong." Mason nodded and left. Rook watched him descend the stairs, then returned to Jonah rather than waiting by the door. That choice belonged to her. On the last morning before the Conservation Trust took possession of the cabin, Jonah drove to Mercer Ridge alone with Rook. The sky had cleared after 2 days of snow. Sunlight touched the upper peaks, while the valley remained blue with shadow. The road was plowed but narrow. Each turn revealed more of the cabin between the trees. Inside, the rooms were nearly empty. Jonah had removed his clothes, tools, photographs, and the chair where his father read weather reports every morning. Only a wooden table, the stove, and a line of hooks remained. A strip of blue painter's tape still crossed the hallway. He had forgotten it. Rook entered behind him and stopped. Jonah stood on the far side. He did not raise his hand. The shepherd looked at the tape, then at him. She stepped over it. No pause. No trembling. Her white toe landed on the old floorboard, and she continued to the kitchen as if the line had never held power. Jonah rested one hand on the wall. There were victories no court recorded. He walked through each room once. In the bedroom closet, he found the brass base of his father's compass beneath a box. The lid had broken at Elk Needle, and the needle assembly no longer worked. Jonah had considered repairing it. Instead, he carried the pieces to the front window. The new site manager would arrive that afternoon. A veteran recovering from a spinal injury would move into the cabin the following week while training with a mobility dog at the center. Jonah placed the broken compass on the windowsill. His father had taught him that a compass did not decide where a man should go. It only made lying about direction more difficult. The object no longer pointed north. It had already done its last useful work. Outside, Rook stood at the edge of the porch, looking toward the old avalanche tower. Snow covered the slope clean and unmarked. The blue survey stakes had been removed. New green ones stood farther uphill, placed after independent review. Jonah locked the door with the mechanical key and slid it beneath the mat for the site manager. He did not keep a copy. Rook came down the steps and waited beside him. For a moment, Jonah looked back at the cabin. The loss rose sharp enough to make him reconsider the key, the trust, the signature on Helen's tablet. Then a light came on inside. The site manager had arrived through the rear entrance earlier than expected. Warm yellow filled the front room, the same room Jonah had believed he needed to own in order to keep it connected to his father. The place had not stopped mattering because it no longer belonged to him. Rook touched her nose to his old field watch. Jonah turned toward the road. Home, he said. The word no longer meant the cabin. It meant the apartment above the hardware store, the Tuesday Maps Owens dishonest card game, Mason's unfinished apology, and a dog who could cross a line without permission. Rook moved beside him down the snowy drive. Their tracks ran together until the road bent through the trees and the cabin disappeared behind them. Neither looked back again. Rook's greatest victory was not finding a hidden station or leading anyone to evidence. It was the quiet morning when she stepped across a strip of blue tape without being ordered. Jonah's healing looked much the same. He could not restore the years lost to anger, keep his father's cabin, or make Mason's failure disappear. He could only choose what would no longer control the next step. Sometimes peace begins that quietly, not when the past becomes harmless, but when we stop giving an old boundary authority over our future. Tell us which moment stayed with you, and subscribe for more stories of loyalty, courage, and hard-earned grace.